Progressions and regressions, the most important aspect of programming when developing fitness and adapted PE programs for the autism population. But what are they and how do we use them? Well, check out this video all about the most important concept in physical attributes of programming. In developing fitness and adapted PE programs for the autism population, we have physical, adaptive, and cognitive functioning. With respect to the physical functioning, we're looking at exercises and programming. What are we going to do with these athletes? What exercises make sense? What exercises don't make sense? What does it mean when we say make sense, right? So with progressions and regressions, we're looking at creating a challenging or a less challenging aspect or variation of an exercise. If we take hurdle steps, for example, we have a hurdle step that is 6 inches high or 9 inches high or 12 inches high. Can that athlete navigate that hurdle step in a way that benefits their movement pattern? Right? So can they get over that hurdle step without compensating? Are they starting to internally rotate? Are we seeing these other compensatory movement patterns that are going to be a problem? Not just a problem in the short term, because in the short term it might not be a big deal, but what are we trying to do with our exercise programs for our athletes? I mean, what's the purpose of doing exercise at all? It's to enhance physical skills. So if we know the level at which we need to program an exercise, we can understand how each individual athlete is going to respond to it once we assess them. Hence the need for an assessment, right? With progressions, we're making an exercise more challenging. We're doing a different variation of an exercise that is going beyond baseline skill. In order to meet that challenge, the athlete is going to have certain skills already intact. They're going to need baseline skills that meet that current level of ability. There's a prerequisite for it, right? Because we're not just going to have them do something that's beyond their skill set over and over and over again. It's not going to do them any good. Even if they're motivated, and this is where we see the intersection of physical and adaptive skill sets, even if they're motivated, which is an adaptive skill set, they're motivated to do it. They want to do it. They're going to do whatever we ask them to do. Great. They're completely coachable right now. And that's where we want to get to from an adaptive perspective. But what happens when they're motivated, but the exercise itself does not fit their current level of ability? We really need to know what's happening, because that level of challenge in that exercise may not make sense for that athlete right now. So what do we have to do? We have to regress it. Regression is a simplification of an exercise. And when we're talking about the autism population, this is perhaps the most crucial aspect of how and what exercises we implement. So if we're coming back to that hurdle step, we might want to go lower with the hurdle step. We might want to go fewer hurdle steps so that the athlete can acclimate to the demand of that particular activity and actually get what they need out of it. Again, if we have a highly motivated athlete, they're going to go through that hurdle step regardless of whether their gait pattern or their hip mobility looks good, right? They probably don't know the difference, but we do, and we should be looking for the best possible movement out of our athletes at all times. That's up to us as coaches to program effectively. So when we're looking at regressions, it's a simplification of a movement, and we can do this with anything. We can do this with our warm-up exercises, so our hurdles, our crawl patterns, our band movements. We can progress or regress as needed. Same thing with our strength exercises. In some of our other autism fitness videos, you might have seen myself or some of our other certified pros have a progression or regression for squats or for overhead presses or for band rows. We know we have a really good exercise when it can be progressed or regressed to any individual at any time. So we want to be able to make an exercise more challenging or more simplified depending on who's in front of us, right? And we also have to understand the basics of human movement to know what an appropriate regression is going to be. For example, if we have an athlete who's pulling back on those bands when they're doing that standing band row, are they really getting everything that they need out of that particular exercise right now? Are they benefiting from it, or are we just calling it something? So there's a difference between labeling the exercise and saying this is a standing band row versus our athlete actually doing the exercise and getting something out of it. And that is entirely up to us as coaches, as professionals, as someone who is delivering a fitness or adapted PE or recreational program for the autism population to understand. We need to understand movement and what it's supposed to look like. We know that with the autism population, we're certainly going to see deficits in strength, in stability, in motor planning. So how do we prepare ourselves and how do we prepare our athletes for success? It's not just enough to have a bunch of exercises. We want to put them together in a way that is conducive to our athletes moving better, enjoying movement, and seeing it generalize beyond the fitness session. And the only way that is going to happen is if we find the right progressions and regressions. Now, with progressions, we can come up with a couple different ways to perform an exercise. There are things that we can add to it. So we can add more repetitions, we can add more weight, we can add more directions, we can get into some really cool motor planning skills as well, where we start chaining together different exercises. For example, when we have an athlete do cone touches and then a hurdle step and then a bear walk, there's a lot of level change there. There's a lot of different manipulation of the environment. There's a locomotive component to it as well. So there are all these different movement patterns put into this one sequence. That's great, but what happens when we have to break that down? What happens when we have an athlete who is not yet able to do any of those three exercises with any mastery over the skill? We have to keep dialing back and again regressing the exercise to the point at which they have mastery. They can do it independently, they can do it on their own, and they can do it with good form. So understanding what good form looks like is crucial to making your decisions about what exercise makes sense. Again, with this population, we owe them the absolute best in programming, we owe them the best in adapted PE. So it's not enough to just say, well, we have a program together and we have a bunch of exercises together, or we have a treadmill, or we have this machine, or we have that machine. Forget the machines. Look at the movement. What are we trying to improve? We know for the autism population, most of the time, we're trying to improve gait pattern, we're trying to improve stability, because we hear that term low tone a lot, right? What does low tone mean? Low tone simply means that we're going to see deficits in the major movement patterns, in squatting, in pushing, in pulling, in locomotion. So how do we put together a program that meets those needs while at the same time regressing the activity or regressing the exercise enough that the athlete is able to perform with best level of ability right now, and we're able to set small incremental goals for them, whether those goals are physical, adaptive, or cognitive. Back to progressions and regressions, we need to know when it's appropriate to progress an exercise. Now, in autism fitness, we have certain criteria for when an athlete is able, or an instructor or a professional is ready to give them some type of challenge or a more advanced variation of an exercise. That doesn't happen until the athlete can demonstrate that they have mastery over one level of this skill. With hurdles, for example, we usually use 6 hurdles in a row, and once the athlete can show us that they can step over all 6 of those hurdles 3 times, so 3 different sets, without any internal rotation, with good form, with really getting those knees up, all right, now it might be time to progress the activity. So we can go higher hurdles, right? But we don't even need to do all of the hurdles at a greater height at once. We can start with 1 higher hurdle. So progressions can be at the level of progress of that particular individual. Sometimes it makes perfect sense to make all of the hurdles higher. So we can have an athlete who goes from 6-inch hurdles to 12-inch hurdles in a single session, but that's not the norm. The norm is we have the athlete go through those 6-inch hurdles multiple times for multiple sets over the course of multiple sessions, and eventually we can determine, well, it's time for them to progress because they've really got this down. There's no point in progressing if the athlete hasn't developed the skill set yet and they haven't mastered it. It'd be the same thing as not being able to do addition and subtraction and moving on to algebra. Like, you need the baseline first. So we call this the criteria for baseline mastery. And that's what the exercise should look like before you start progressing. And if the athlete can't demonstrate that criteria for baseline mastery, that's fine. Then we're just going to regress or simplify the exercise. So to sum everything up, progressions and regressions are the most important part of the physical side of programming for the autism population. And you need to understand from a programming perspective and from a movement perspective what makes sense as far as the exercise selection and what makes sense as far as the challenge level of this particular exercise. Because if the athlete isn't performing it properly, then they're not deriving the total benefit from this exercise. And we can also exacerbate some of the common movement issues that we have among the autism population. So we'd rather, and it is to their benefit, to start off with a regressed or simplified version of that exercise, develop mastery, and then move on. We can always make something more challenging. The real key and the art and science of coaching is knowing when to regress and how to support that athlete so that they are successful in that movement, successful in that exercise, and successful during that session. I'm Autism Fitness founder Eric Chesson. For more, go to autismfitness.com, and thank you for watching.